Carl Jung's shadow self, confronting the darkness within. Everyone carries a shadow, Carl Jung once wrote, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We all like to believe we are good people, that we act with reason, that we are in control. But buried deep beneath the surface of the self lies another truth, an unconscious part of us that holds our darkest thoughts, instincts, and fears. This is the shadow, not a monster from a horror film, but something much more real. It is the part of your psyche that you deny, repress, and hide from both yourself and the world. And the more you ignore it, the more power it has over you. In this video, we dive deep into the terrifying yet liberating concept of the shadow self as developed by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. A towering figure in the world of depth psychology, Jung gave us tools not just to treat neuroses, but to discover who we really are underneath the masks we wear. This is not a journey of comfort. It is a journey into the unknown terrain of the human soul, into the darkness that defines us, shapes us, and, if we are courageous enough to face it, transforms us. You'll discover how the shadow forms, why we fear it, and what happens when we fail to confront it. We'll explore projections, repression, mythological archetypes, and the terrifying honesty required for true self-knowledge. And most importantly, we'll uncover how facing your shadow can be the most powerful act of freedom. Welcome to the world of Carl Jung. Welcome to the darkness within. Let's begin. What is the shadow self? The shadow self is one of Carl Jung's most profound and vital contributions to psychology. It represents the unconscious aspects of our personality that the conscious ego does not identify with. These are the traits, impulses, and memories we reject or deny, often because they are deemed unacceptable by society, family, or our own moral compass. Jung described the shadow as the thing a person has no wish to be. It includes both the personal unconscious, our individual repressed experiences, and elements of the collective unconscious, including instinctual drives that we share as a species. While people often think of the shadow as simply negative or evil, Jung emphasized that the shadow can contain positive qualities too. Traits like assertiveness, confidence, ambition, or sensuality that may have been suppressed due to early conditioning. Formation of the shadow. The shadow begins to take form in childhood. As children, we are highly sensitive to what gains approval and what provokes punishment. Through a process called socialization, we learn to adapt to our environment. In doing so, we split off parts of ourselves, hiding away the traits that threaten our sense of safety or belonging. For example, a naturally assertive child might be punished for talking back, learning to suppress their voice. A curious child who explores sexuality may be shamed, creating a lifelong rift between them and their own body. A boy who cries may be told to man up, bearing his emotional sensitivity. A girl who enjoys competition may be labeled unladylike, thus learning to downplay her strength. These disowned traits don't disappear. They are pushed into the unconscious mind, forming the shadow. And over time, we forget they were ever part of us. The persona versus the shadow. Jung saw the psyche as made up of multiple layers and complexes. Two of the most critical in this dynamic are the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask we wear in public. It is our socially acceptable identity, the version of ourselves we present to the world. We create it based on the roles we play: parent, student, leader, friend. It's necessary for functioning in society, but it is not our whole truth. The shadow is everything that the persona excludes. It's like a mirror image or a repressed twin. The more rigid and idealized the persona becomes, the more shadow material builds up in the unconscious. This creates inner tension, and if unexamined, this tension can lead to internal conflict, projection, or even psychological breakdown. How the shadow manifests. The shadow doesn't stay quietly locked away. It leaks out in dreams, fantasies, slips of the tongue, irrational anger, jealousy, compulsive behavior, addictions, and even humor. Consider these everyday scenarios. You judge someone as arrogant, when deep down, you're suppressing your own need for recognition. You ridicule another's lifestyle, masking your own envy or unacknowledged desires. You fear someone's intensity because you've denied your own power. Dreams are a particularly fertile ground for shadow imagery. You may dream of being chased, attacked, shamed, or turned into an animal. These symbols are not random. They are manifestations of the shadow self trying to make itself known. The dual nature of the shadow. While much of the shadow is composed of darker or socially unacceptable impulses, such as rage, lust, greed, laziness, or cowardice, it can also contain hidden gifts. Many people disown their creativity, sensuality, confidence, or leadership because these qualities were not nurtured in their upbringing. Jung warned against labeling the shadow as purely evil. To do so would perpetuate the split. Integration requires recognizing both the dark and light within the shadow. This is what makes it so powerful and so healing. To summarize, the shadow self is everything we unconsciously repress or deny. It forms through early experiences of shame, fear, and rejection. It is the counterpart to the persona, our public mask. It manifests in behavior, emotion, projection, and dreams. It contains both our darkest impulses and our greatest unrealized potential. Understanding the shadow is not about moral judgment. It is about truth, about seeing ourselves clearly, wholly, and without illusion. Repression and projection. To understand how the shadow operates, we must examine two of its most fundamental psychological mechanisms: repression and projection. These are not merely clinical terms. They are dynamic, lived experiences that shape the way we relate to ourselves and the world around us every day. Repression, the birth of the shadow. Repression is the psychological act of pushing thoughts, memories, emotions, or desires out of conscious awareness. It is a survival mechanism, often rooted in early childhood experiences. Imagine a child being told, "Don't cry, stop being so sensitive. Anger is bad, be nice. You're too loud, be quiet. Girls don't act like that. Boys don't show fear." Every time this child has a natural human response but is met with shame, punishment, or emotional withdrawal, a part of their psyche goes underground. Over time, a hidden reservoir of unacknowledged material begins to build up. Repression happens in the moment, often without conscious choice. We're conditioned to believe that certain emotions or traits are dangerous, not just socially, but existentially. We fear losing love, safety, or belonging if we show them, so we deny them. This denied content becomes the shadow. But make no mistake, what is repressed does not disappear. It waits, and if ignored long enough, it begins to act autonomously. The unconscious pressure cooker. The unconscious is like a pressure cooker. The more we repress, the greater the internal tension becomes. This tension demands release, and if it doesn't find a healthy outlet, it will erupt in unhealthy ways. Examples include sudden emotional outbursts, self-sabotaging decisions, chronic guilt or shame, paranoia or judgment toward others, psychosomatic illnesses. In Jungian terms, what we repress will either be projected outward or turned inward as neurosis. Either way, it distorts our experience of reality. Projection. Seeing the shadow in others? Projection is the unconscious transfer of your own disowned traits onto someone else. It is the mind's way of saying, "This isn't me, it's them." According to Jung, everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. Projection is subtle, deceptive, and incredibly powerful. It can completely distort how we view others and how we understand ourselves. Here are common examples. You despise someone's arrogance, unaware of your own suppressed ego needs. You envy a peer's success, unaware of how you've sabotaged your ambition. You accuse someone of manipulation, blind to your own strategic behavior. You fear others will betray you, not realizing your own difficulty with trust or intimacy. Projection is often strongest when you are emotionally triggered by someone's behavior. If your reaction feels disproportionate to the event, chances are you're facing your own shadow. The shadow in relationships. Relationships are fertile ground for projection. Romantic partnerships, in particular, often become battlegrounds for unconscious material. We project our unmet needs, unresolved traumas, and denied traits onto the other. The result? Repeating patterns, emotional volatility, codependency, resentment. This is why Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Healing in relationships begins with recognizing the projections we cast. Only when we take back what we have disowned can we begin to relate authentically. The collective shadow. Projection doesn't only occur on an individual level, it also manifests in groups, cultures, and societies. This is called the collective shadow. When entire communities or nations disown aspects of themselves, they project those traits onto the other. This creates scapegoating, racism, xenophobia, witch hunts, moral panics, war. History is full of examples. Inquisitions based on moral purity, pogroms fueled by economic envy, genocides born from projected fear and inferiority, political propaganda portraying enemies as monsters. The consequences of unintegrated shadows are not just personal, they are civilizational. How to recognize projection? Start by examining the people you have strong emotional reactions to. Ask, what do I most criticize in others? What traits in people irritate, trigger, or disgust me? Is it possible that I share or repress those same traits? Also, look at your idolizations. Sometimes we project the golden shadow, the positive traits we refuse to own. You might idealize someone's creativity, charisma, or power because you've suppressed your own. Projection is a mirror. When used wisely, it becomes a tool of self-discovery. The power of taking back projections. When you identify a projection and take it back, you reclaim part of your shadow, and with it, a piece of your power. You stop blaming others. You stop fearing what's outside. You begin to see the world more clearly because you're no longer hiding from yourself. This is not easy. It requires humility, courage, a willingness to feel uncomfortable. But this is the work of inner transformation. To recap, repression creates the shadow by hiding unwanted parts of the self. Projection occurs when we unconsciously see those parts in others. Shadow work involves recognizing these mechanisms and reclaiming disowned material. When we project onto others, we distort reality and hinder growth. When we take back our projections, we begin the journey toward wholeness. Jung taught us that the shadow is not something to eliminate, it's something to integrate. And that begins by seeing what we've spent our whole lives trying not to see. Self, why you must face the shadow. Carl Jung understood something that many people are afraid to admit. The greatest danger to our well-being is not outside of us, it's inside. Not in others, but in ourselves. The unconfronted shadow is the root of much suffering, both personal and collective. To ignore the shadow is to walk through life half asleep, believing you are free while unknowingly ruled by unconscious forces. The longer you avoid it, the more power it gains over you. What you resist persists. Carl Jung, The Psychological Cost of Avoiding the Shadow. Repressed material doesn't simply fade away. It accumulates in the unconscious, becoming what Jung called a complex. These complexes are emotionally charged clusters of thoughts, feelings, and memories that can hijack our behavior. Unintegrated shadow material can lead to chronic anxiety, depression, addictions, compulsive behaviors, unexplained anger or irritability, emotional numbness, self-loathing and shame, perfectionism or over-identification with the good person persona. You might feel stuck in repetitive life patterns, attracting the same toxic relationships, sabotaging success, or fleeing from intimacy. These are not just random misfortunes. They are signs that the shadow is demanding to be seen. The dangers of repressed virtue. Interestingly, Jung pointed out that people often repress not just dark or immoral impulses, but also their greatest gifts: courage, sensuality, assertiveness, ambition, creativity. These can be feared just as much as rage or envy. For instance, someone raised in a family that discouraged self-expression might unconsciously suppress their creativity. Or a person taught to be submissive may repress their natural leadership instincts. As a result, we shrink ourselves. We become timid, indecisive, disconnected from our inner fire. This is not humility, it's self-abandonment. Facing the shadow means reclaiming the full range of your humanity, not just what is safe and acceptable, but what is wild, instinctual, and real. The illusion of the good person. One of Jung's most provocative insights was his criticism of the idealized good person. Many people build their entire identity around being nice, moral, and virtuous. But this can become a trap. When you over-identify with the light, you inevitably repress the dark. This creates a fragile ego, one that can't tolerate conflict, anger, or imperfection. You may develop a spiritual persona, a saintly facade, or a hyper-moral attitude. But behind that mask often lies resentment, arrogance, or deep insecurity. The good person becomes brittle, judgmental, or secretly destructive. Jung warned, if you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. Such a man has saddled himself with new problems. But he is also the only genuine personality and the only one who can be truly moral. True morality does not come from denial, it comes from awareness. When the shadow possesses you, the most dangerous shadow is the one that controls you from the dark. When ignored, it acts out in uncontrollable ways. This possession can take many forms. Sudden fits of rage or cruelty, acting in ways you don't understand, sabotaging relationships or goals, obsessive judgment of others, prejudice or dehumanization, depression that feels like a loss of soul. Jung described this as being overtaken by the shadow archetype, a kind of inner hijacking where your ego loses control. It's not that you become evil, it's that your repressed impulses have erupted without your consent or understanding. The only way to prevent possession is through conscious integration. The spiritual necessity of shadow work. Shadow work is not only psychological, it is spiritual. Jung saw it as a sacred process that reconnects us with the self, the deepest and most divine aspect of our being. He believed that the path to enlightenment does not lie in denying the dark, but in illuminating it. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Facing the shadow humbles you. It strips away the illusions of superiority, perfection, and moral grandiosity. But in doing so, it grounds you in reality. You become more compassionate, resilient, and integrated. This is not about becoming flawless, it's about becoming whole, the rewards of facing the shadow. Though painful, shadow work offers immense rewards: greater self-awareness, emotional depth and maturity, stronger relationships built on honesty, creative and sexual vitality, authenticity and inner peace, a deeper connection to meaning and purpose. You no longer live in fear of your own impulses. You become less reactive and more reflective. You learn to respond rather than to project. Most importantly, you reclaim the lost parts of yourself, those forgotten gifts, neglected passions, and silenced voices that have been waiting in the dark. The shadow is your ally. Ultimately, the shadow is not your enemy. It is your ally. It is the gatekeeper to your wholeness. It confronts you not to destroy you, but to awaken you. Every trigger, every projection, every moment of inner conflict is an invitation to go deeper, to see clearly, to heal. You can either continue to flee from your shadow or turn around and face it with open eyes. When you do, you may find that the darkness you feared contains the very treasure you've been searching for. Shadow work and individuation. The process of becoming your whole, authentic self, what Jung called individuation, is at the heart of his psychological philosophy. It is the unfolding of your full potential through conscious integration of all aspects of the psyche: the ego, the persona, the shadow, the anima, animus, and ultimately the self. Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. Carl Jung. Shadow work is not separate from this process. It is one of its foundations. Without confronting and integrating the shadow, individuation remains a distant ideal, not a lived reality. Why shadow work is essential to individuation. Most people live within a narrow range of self-awareness. They identify with their persona, their job, social role, or public identity, believing it to be the whole of who they are. The unconscious contents of the psyche remain hidden, yet exert enormous influence over choices, moods, and behaviors. Jung believed that individuation requires the descent into the unconscious. Like a mythic hero's journey, the ego must descend, confront its opposite, and emerge transformed. Shadow work is that descent. Without it, there is no transformation, only projection, repression, and fragmentation. With it, there is depth, richness, and wholeness. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Carl Jung, The 3 Stages of Shadow Integration. Though shadow work is deeply personal and non-linear, it often unfolds in stages. 1. Recognition. This is the awakening, the moment you become aware that you are not wholly in control of yourself. Triggers, emotional outbursts, destructive habits, these become doorways into deeper inquiry. What do I judge most harshly in others? What makes me irrationally angry or ashamed? Where do I feel powerless, reactive, or stuck? This stage requires brutal honesty, no excuses, no self-flattery, just observation. 2nd, dialogue. Once the shadow is recognized, the next step is to build a relationship with it. Jung referred to this as active imagination, engaging directly with unconscious material. You might journal as if speaking to the shadow. Imagine a conversation with the part of you that is envious, selfish, or afraid. Ask what it wants, why it feels unheard, how it was created. This is not about justification or indulgence. It is about understanding. When you speak to your shadow, you often discover it is not a monster, but a wounded child, a suppressed genius, a banished protector. 3rd, integration. Integration means reclaiming what was lost. It doesn't mean acting out every impulse or accepting every emotion as truth. Rather, it's about learning to hold these parts with consciousness. For example, a repressed assertiveness becomes healthy boundaries. A suppressed anger becomes strength in standing up for yourself. A buried desire for attention becomes a creative pursuit. The goal is not perfection, but balance. You don't destroy the shadow, you learn to walk beside it. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung, Tools and Practices for Shadow Work. Here are practical ways to begin integrating your shadow. 1. Dream analysis. Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. They bypass the ego's defenses and deliver raw, symbolic messages from the deeper psyche. Look for characters or themes in your dreams that disturb you, seduce you, or chase you. These often represent shadow aspects. Ask, what does this character represent in me? What emotion did I feel toward them? What might this dream be telling me about a part of myself I've ignored? 2. Shadow journaling. Set aside time regularly to write uncensored thoughts and feelings. Reflect on your emotional triggers, judgments of others, and recurring patterns in your life. Prompt examples. Something I hate about other people is, I'm afraid people will find out that I am. A part of me I wish didn't exist is, the goal is not to edit or polish, but to be radically honest. 3rd, mirror work. Look at yourself in the mirror and speak truths you normally avoid. Confront the parts of yourself you usually hide. Acknowledge your fears, flaws, and unspoken desires aloud. This practice strengthens the ability to witness yourself without judgment, an essential step toward integration. 4th, inner dialogue and parts work. Inspired by Jung's active imagination and modern internal family systems, IFS therapy, this involves identifying and dialoguing with parts of yourself, your inner critic, inner child, inner rebel, inner addict, etc. Each part has a voice, a story, a reason for existing. By listening without suppression or control, you allow these aspects to reintegrate. 5th, embodiment and somatic practices. The shadow is not just mental, it's physical. Emotional repression often manifests in the body. Clenched jaws, tight chests, shallow breathing, muscle tension. Practices like breath work, dance, Trauma release exercises or yoga can help release stored energy and reconnect with instinctual wisdom. The challenges of shadow work. Shadow work is not for the faint of heart. It often brings discomfort, grief, shame, resistance, emotional chaos. It can disrupt relationships, challenge long-held beliefs, and force you to reconsider who you are. But this discomfort is not punishment. It is purification. It is the burning away of illusion to reveal what is real. If the path before you is clear, you're probably on someone else's. Carl Jung, the light within the shadow. Jung believed that the shadow contains not only the inferior parts of the personality, but also great potential. He spoke of the golden shadow, the positive aspects of the self that we are too afraid, too humble, or too conditioned to own. Your power, your creativity, your sexual energy, your capacity for leadership, your inner genius, these may have been hidden alongside your fear and shame. When you do shadow work, you don't just become more whole, you become more alive. Individuation, becoming the self. Individuation is not the end of suffering, it is the transformation of suffering into meaning. It is the alchemical journey of turning unconscious chaos into conscious order. As you integrate the shadow, you move from fragmentation to unity. You become less reactive, more grounded, more sovereign. You no longer depend on others for validation, nor do you fear their judgments. You walk your path, not perfectly, but authentically. This is the beginning of true freedom. The shadow in religion, myth, and archetypes. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche expresses itself through symbols. Dreams, myths, religious imagery, and ancient stories are not arbitrary. They are the language of the unconscious. These symbolic narratives carry timeless truths about human nature, especially about the parts of ourselves we do not consciously recognize. The shadow appears everywhere in myth and religion, not because ancient people were superstitious, but because they understood something we have forgotten: that the battle between light and dark, good and evil, is not merely out in the world, it is within the human soul. Myth is the natural and indispensable intermediate stage between unconscious and conscious cognition. Carl Jung. By studying myth, religion, and archetypes, we can begin to see our own inner journey reflected back to us and recognize that our struggles with the shadow are part of a universal story. The shadow in religious traditions. Religions throughout history have personified the shadow in striking ways, through devils, tempters, destroyers, and fallen angels. Christianity. In Christian tradition, the figure of Satan serves as the ultimate projection of evil. He was once Lucifer, the bringer of light, who fell from grace due to pride. This echoes the psychological fall from conscious identity into unconscious desire. But Jung warned against over-identifying with goodness at the cost of disowning evil. When evil is solely externalized, people become blind to the sin within. Religious purity can create repression, judgment, and shadow possession. The devil is not a mere symbol of evil, but a reality that lives in the human soul. Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, where he confronts Satan, is a classic mythic symbol of the individuation journey, facing and overcoming the shadow through spiritual integration. Hinduism. In Hindu mythology, gods often have fierce and destructive aspects. Shiva is both the destroyer and the creator. Kali is terrifying in appearance, but represents the power to destroy the ego and liberate the soul. Hinduism teaches that destruction is not evil, but necessary for transformation. This aligns perfectly with Jung's idea that the shadow is not something to eliminate, but something to engage in order to grow. Buddhism. Buddhist teachings warn against attachment, desire, and delusion, all forces that live in the shadow. The concept of Mara, the tempter who tried to distract the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, is symbolic of the inner chaos that arises when we seek awakening. The Buddha's victory over Mara represents the integration of fear, doubt, and illusion, a psychological mastery over the unconscious. Islam. Islam speaks of the nafs, the lower self, which includes base desires and impulses. The spiritual journey, jihad al-nafs, involves the struggle to purify and understand the self. It is not about annihilation, but transformation. This is another metaphor for the process of shadow work, acknowledging the lower self as a stage in the path to union with the divine. The shadow in mythology. Every mythic hero must face the shadow. Whether it's a dragon, a demon, a monster, or a dark twin, the pattern is universal. Jung recognized these as archetypes, universal psychological structures that emerge in stories, dreams, and cultures. The shadow archetype appears most clearly in the enemy, the trickster, the beast, and the underworld guide. The underworld descent. Myths across cultures feature a journey into the underworld, a descent into darkness where the hero confronts death, fear, or the unknown. Examples include Orpheus descending to rescue Eurydice, Inanna entering the underworld to face her dark sister, Ereshkigal, Dante's Inferno, where he walks through the 9 circles of hell, the Egyptian Book of the Dead guiding souls through the Duat. These stories symbolize psychological shadow work. The descent is a metaphor for turning inward, facing fear, guilt, and unconscious patterns. The trickster. The trickster is a chaotic, rule-breaking figure who disrupts order and mocks authority. Loki, Hermes, Anansi, Coyote, all tricksters represent the shadow's potential for creative destruction. The trickster reveals hypocrisy, exposes the truth, and forces growth. Though disruptive, it is a necessary archetype for psychological evolution. The trickster is a collective shadow figure, a summation of all the inferior traits of character in individuals. To embrace the trickster is to confront your own irrational, wild, and disruptive tendencies, and find creative energy there. The shadow twin. Many myths feature a hero with a dark twin or adversary, like Set versus Horus, Cain versus Abel, or Romulus versus Remus. These battles reflect the tension within the psyche between the known self and the denied other. In modern terms, this is like encountering someone who embodies what you repress. If not integrated, this conflict can become literal war, inside or outside. Shadow archetypes in Jungian psychology. Jung names several archetypes related to the shadow. Understanding these can help you identify them in your own inner world. 1. The shadow. The personification of all the traits you reject, deny, or fear within yourself. It may appear in dreams or projections as an enemy, animal, or terrifying figure. 2. The anima, animus. The feminine side of a man, anima, and the masculine side of a woman, animus. These archetypes often carry disowned emotional, creative, or rational traits. When unintegrated, they become seductive, manipulative, or overbearing figures in dreams or relationships. 3. The self, the central archetype, the totality of the psyche. It is the union of all opposites, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. The self emerges only when the shadow and persona are both acknowledged and integrated. 4. The wise old man, woman. A symbol of inner guidance that often appears only after the confrontation with the shadow. In mythology, this is the wizard, sage, crone, or mentor. They do not appear before the underworld trial. The modern relevance of myth and religion. In a secular age, many dismiss myth and religion as outdated or naive, but Jung saw them as symbolic systems that encoded deep psychological truths. When we lose myth, we lose a map of the soul. We become psychologically homeless, floating without direction, cut off from the symbols that once guided inner transformation. By reinterpreting religious stories and mythological narratives as symbolic expressions of the psyche, we can recover their power without needing to return to dogma or superstition. Why archetypes matter? Jung's genius was in showing that the inner world has structure, that the unconscious is not just chaos, but a living symbolic system. Myths and religions are mirrors of the inner journey. To understand the shadow through these lenses is to deepen your self-awareness. It is to realize that you are not the first to face this darkness, and you are not alone. Your shadow is not a curse. It is a call to descend, to confront, to awaken. In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. Modern applications of the shadow. Carl Jung's insights about the shadow were revolutionary in the early 20th century, but they may be even more relevant today. In an era dominated by self-branding, online personas, polarized ideologies, and curated perfection, the need for inner honesty and psychological integration is urgent. The shadow is no longer just a subject for analysts and philosophers. It has become a necessary framework for navigating modern life. From therapy rooms to boardrooms, from social justice movements to personal growth trends, the shadow is rising. 1. The shadow in therapy and mental health. Many therapeutic approaches today, especially those influenced by depth psychology, understand that long-term healing requires working with the unconscious. Modern Jungian and integrative therapists help clients explore emotional triggers as gateways to the shadow, repetitive patterns in relationships, nightmares and symbols in dreams, somatic expressions of repressed energy, the conflict between their public persona and inner truth. Other therapy models such as internal family systems, IFS, psychodynamic therapy, Gestalt therapy, and even cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, often address shadow material, whether explicitly or not. In these settings, shadow work helps clients understand projections that distort reality, reclaim agency and power, make peace with inner parts that have long been exiled, unravel shame, guilt, and self-loathing. Trauma healing, too, often involves confronting the shadow, not because the trauma itself is the shadow, but because how we internalize, suppress, or protect ourselves from trauma creates unconscious behaviors and false identities. 2. The shadow in the self-help industry. Ironically, the self-help industry, designed to improve people's lives, often encourages avoidance of the shadow. Many books and influencers promote toxic positivity, hustle culture, high vibration-only mindsets, endless optimization and productivity. While well-intentioned, these approaches can bypass emotional truth. They risk reinforcing the persona while bearing pain, fear, grief, anger, and insecurity deeper into the unconscious. True growth doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from facing discomfort honestly, sitting with contradictions, and allowing emotional integration. Some thought leaders, especially those influenced by Jung or shadow-focused thinkers like Robert Bly, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, James Hollis, and Debbie Ford, are helping to bring deeper awareness to this imbalance. They speak to the necessity of wholeness over improvement. 3. The shadow in creativity and art. Artists have long known what psychologists are just beginning to rediscover. Your greatest creative power lies in your unconscious. Writers, musicians, filmmakers, and visual artists often access shadow material instinctively. They express the forbidden, the painful, the strange. This is why great art moves us. It reveals what we hide. Examples include the haunting films of David Lynch or Darren Aronofsky, the tortured beauty of Van Gogh's paintings, the raw poetry of Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton, the lyrics of musicians confronting addiction, loss, and rage. Creativity is a form of alchemy. It transforms inner darkness into beauty, meaning, and connection. When you allow your shadow into your art, it becomes your muse, not your monster. 4. The shadow in leadership and business. In leadership, unexamined shadow traits can be catastrophic. Leaders who suppress insecurity may become authoritarian. Those who avoid vulnerability may develop toxic work environments. When the desire for control, dominance, or recognition remains unconscious, it festers and manipulates from the background. 5. The shadow in relationships. All relationships are mirrors, reflecting not only who we are, but what we've denied. In romantic partnerships especially, the shadow emerges in full force. You may project your unmet parental needs onto your partner. Blame them for feelings you haven't processed. Idolize or demonize them based on past wounds. Fear intimacy because it threatens your persona. Sabotage love because you unconsciously believe you're unworthy of it. Shadow-aware individuals learn to take responsibility for their projections. They pause before reacting. They use conflict not to blame, but to deepen understanding. They recognize that the enemy is not their partner. It is the disowned part of themselves they're seeing reflected back. This awareness also enhances empathy. When you know your own darkness, you are less likely to judge someone else for theirs. 6. The shadow in social and political movements. Much of what we see in modern social conflict can be traced to collective shadow dynamics. Societies, like individuals, repress and project. This shows up as political polarization and tribalism, moral superiority and cancel culture, scapegoating minorities or outsiders, historical amnesia and denial, the demonization of dissent. Both the political left and right are guilty of shadow projection, blaming the other for what they secretly fear in themselves. True social evolution requires collective introspection, humility, and maturity. Shadow work in this context doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means rooting out the unconscious forces that perpetuate it. Jung believed that until individuals confront their personal shadows, societies will remain divided by fear and illusion. The change must begin with the individual. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. 7. The shadow in technology and social media. Modern technology has given us immense power to create, connect, and learn, but it has also amplified our shadow. Social media in particular often functions as a projection field, a place where envy is disguised as criticism, fear becomes outrage, loneliness becomes comparison, moral superiority hides shame. The persona is carefully curated, while the shadow is ignored. We have built platforms for performance, not authenticity, and the more we polish our image, the more estranged we become from the truth of who we are. This doesn't mean abandoning technology, but using it consciously. To bring more depth, vulnerability, and shadow awareness into our digital lives is a modern spiritual task. 8. The return of the inner world. In a time of climate anxiety, economic instability, mental health crises, and existential dread, many are realizing that no amount of external success or distraction can fill the void. People are turning inward, seeking meaning, healing trauma, exploring dreams, archetypes, psychedelics, meditation, and ancient wisdom traditions. This is not regression, it is evolution. Jung's vision was not to return us to the past, but to awaken us to the symbolic world we lost, a world where the soul matters, where darkness is not feared but honored, where the goal is not to be perfect but to be whole. Carl Jung quotes and their meanings. Carl Jung was not just a pioneering psychologist, he was also a masterful writer and a spiritual philosopher. His words carry profound psychological insight and spiritual depth, often distilled into compact, quotable phrases. Many of Jung's most quoted lines speak directly to the concept of the shadow. These quotes, when unpacked, offer us guidance, both for personal transformation and for understanding the world. Below, we explore a selection of Jung's most famous quotes on the shadow and break down what they truly mean in the context of your life and inner work. 1. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is perhaps Jung's most iconic quote, and often the most misunderstood. Modern spiritual culture frequently equates enlightenment with positivity, peace, and bliss. But Jung flips this notion on its head. He reminds us that real light is born through confrontation with darkness. True awakening is not about transcending pain, but understanding it. Not about pretending to be good, but embracing wholeness. Every time you bring awareness to your fear, jealousy, anger, or shame, you move closer to real inner freedom. 2. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This line reveals the power of the unconscious mind. What we don't acknowledge in ourselves still affects us, through our decisions, relationships, fears, and behaviors. When something repeatedly goes wrong in life, failed relationships, destructive habits, emotional spirals, it's tempting to blame external forces or believe it's just how life is. But often it's the shadow pulling the strings. Application: reflect on recurring life patterns. Ask, what inner belief, fear, or denial is at work here? That awareness is the beginning of change. 3. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. We tend to fear in others what we have not accepted in ourselves. When you are blind to your shadow, you are easily disturbed, threatened, or offended by others' behavior, especially when it mirrors what you repress. But when you've faced your own anger, guilt, and insecurity, you become more compassionate. Not naive, but understanding. You stop projecting. You listen more deeply. Next time someone triggers you, ask, what part of me is reacting here? Rather than judge, investigate. 4. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Integrating the shadow is not a lighthearted self-help exercise. It's a moral act. It demands that we own the things we wish weren't true about ourselves, and that we do so with courage and integrity. It's easier to blame the world, remain in denial, or wear a mask of righteousness. But Jung challenges us to grow up psychologically, to take radical responsibility. Application. Make a list of traits you most dislike in others. Ask, do I possess these in any way, even subtly? That realization is moral courage. 5. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. We see this everywhere, in overwork, in addiction, in constant distraction, in obsessive political or religious ideology, in compulsive relationships, in consumerism. People will do anything to avoid sitting with themselves in silence, because in that silence the shadow speaks, and it can be terrifying. But that is the very space where transformation begins. The soul is not found in noise, but in reflection. Spend 10 minutes a day in silence without your phone, TV, or distractions. Notice what arises. That discomfort is sacred material. 6. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. To truly accept yourself, not just your strengths, but your flaws, failures, fantasies, and fears, is perhaps the bravest thing a human being can do. Most of us accept ourselves conditionally. I'll accept myself when I succeed, when I'm better, when I'm loved. But Jung saw that real self-love begins not when we become ideal, but when we face ourselves as we are, without illusion, without flattery, without self-hatred. Affirm, even this part of me has a right to exist. Repeat it to the traits you most want to change. Let that be the doorway to healing. Your shadow work begins now. This is not just a video, this is an invitation. You don't need to be perfect to begin shadow work. You just need to be willing. Willing to ask real questions, willing to sit with discomfort, willing to let go of who you think you're supposed to be and step into who you truly are. Here's how you can start today. Journal your triggers. When you judge or react strongly, write it down. What does this say about you? Study your dreams. Pay attention to recurring themes, animals, dark figures. Your unconscious is speaking. Notice your projections. Ask, what do I see in others that I cannot see in myself? Practice radical honesty with yourself, with others. Speak what you normally silence. Explore art. Write, paint, dance. Let the shadow out in symbolic form. Seek help. A therapist, mentor, or coach can guide you through the terrain you've been avoiding. Above all, do not fear the dark. It is not here to hurt you. It is here to awaken you. The path of individuation is the most important journey a person can take, not just for personal healing, but for the healing of the world. Because when one person confronts their shadow, they help liberate humanity from unconscious violence. When one person becomes whole, they break cycles of trauma. They love more truthfully. They lead more wisely. They live more deeply. Be that person. Face your darkness. Reclaim your light. Become whole. This is not the end. This is where it begins. If you found this exploration meaningful, share it with someone you care about. Start the conversation. Help normalize the truth that healing begins in the dark. And remember, the shadow does not block the light. It reveals where the light must go. Subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations into psychology, philosophy, healing, and the hidden dimensions of the human mind. Your journey inward has only just begun, so stay with us. Together we go deeper.